They told me Serenity Hollow was a fresh start, a quiet life. They didn't tell me that the quiet is a living thing and it has rules. They didn't tell me that perfection has a price, and that the price is your own reflection. I broke their rules. Now, when I look in the mirror, it's not always my own face that looks back. Here is part 1 of the story, written entirely in English, following all the provided instructions. They told me Serenity Hollow was a fresh start, a quiet life. They didn't tell me that the quiet is a living thing, and it has rules. They didn't tell me that perfection has a price, and that the price is your own reflection. I broke their rules. Now, when I look in the mirror, it's not always my own face that looks back. Part 1. Every resident here follows one set of rules. The first thing that strikes you about Serenity Hollow is the silence. It's not a peaceful silence, the kind you seek when you're escaping the city. It's a thick, heavy blanket of a silence. It muffles everything. The hum of the refrigerator in my new kitchen sounded like an industrial generator. The squeak of my sneakers on the polished hardwood floors was a gunshot in a library. I'd moved here, to this immaculately planned, surgically clean suburban paradise, to escape the noise of my life. The sirens, the arguments from the apartment next door, the relentless thrum of a million lives stacked on top of each other. I craved quiet. But this wasn't quiet. This was the absence of sound, and the difference is terrifying. My name is Leo. I'm a software developer, which is a convenient way of saying I can work from anywhere as long as there's a decent internet connection. After a particularly messy breakup and a project that nearly burned me out, anywhere needed to be as far from my old life as possible. Serenity Hollow appeared in a targeted ad, a pop-up promising a harmonious life. The pictures were absurdly perfect. Rows of identical, beautiful colonial-style houses, lawns so green they looked spray-painted, and not a single car parked on the street. It looked less like a town and more like a movie set, one where the director had demanded absolute sterile perfection. For a man whose life felt like a chaotic mess, that kind of order was magnetic. The moving truck had left an hour ago, leaving me in a cavern of cardboard boxes. The house was, like everything else in this community, flawless. New paint, gleaming appliances, a faint, pleasant smell of lavender and bleach. As I started unpacking the kitchen, I noticed the previous occupants had left something behind. Tucked away in the back of the silverware drawer beneath a faded felt lining was a small black hardcover book. It had no title on the cover, no markings of any kind. It was bound in simple, worn leather. It felt old, much older than the house itself. Curiosity got the better of me. I sat down on a sealed box, the book feeling strangely heavy in my hands, and opened it. The pages were thick, cream-colored paper. Printed in a stark, serif font were the words, "The Rules of Harmony." I chuckled to myself. It had to be a homeowners association thing, a quirky, over-the-top welcome package. I imagined rules about lawn maintenance and trash can placement. I was wrong. The list began simply enough, but the further I read, the more the amused smile on my face began to fade, replaced by a knot of confusion in my stomach. There were dozens of rules, but these were some of the first ones that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Rule number 1. All exterior lights must be extinguished at precisely 10 p.m. Not a minute sooner, not a minute later. Okay, a little strict, I thought. Maybe they're serious about light pollution. Rule number 7. Ignore any melodies that seem to drift up from beneath the soil after a rainfall. Do not attempt to locate the source. The sound is not for you. My brow furrowed. What the hell did that mean? Rule number 13. If your reflection in a window pane seems to smile when you are not, close the curtains and do not look again until sunrise. Your house is a sanctuary only when you believe it to be. A cold prickle went down my spine. This was moving from quirky to deeply unsettling. Rule number 16. Do not speak to the man who walks the streets at dusk, trimming hedges that do not need trimming. He is not a resident. He is a symptom. Rule number 24. Never, under any circumstances, leave an empty seat at your dining table overnight. If you dine alone, place a book or a bag on the empty chair. An open invitation is always accepted. I slammed the book shut. It had to be a prank. A very elaborate, creepy prank left for the new guy. It was the only logical explanation. My mind, trained to find patterns and solve problems with code, refused to accept any other possibility. I tossed the book back in the drawer, dismissing it as the work of a bored teenager or an eccentric predecessor. A symptom? An open invitation? It was nonsense. The kind of thing you read on some obscure corner of the internet, not in a welcome guide to a pristine suburban community. That first night, I was exhausted. I unpacked until my muscles screamed, then ordered a pizza from the only place that delivered to Serenity Hollow. I ate it sitting on the floor, surrounded by the ghosts of my old life packed neatly into cardboard tombs. By the time I finished, it was well past 11. I hauled myself upstairs, fell into bed without even pulling on the sheets, and was asleep in seconds. I was jolted awake by a sound like a rifle shot. It was sharp, violent, and it came from right outside my bedroom window. My heart hammered against my ribs. I scrambled out of bed, creeping to the window and peering through the blinds. The source of the sound was immediately obvious. The single bulb in the porch light fixture below had exploded. Shards of glass glittered on the pristine welcome mat. My first thought was a power surge, or maybe the wiring in this new house wasn't as perfect as it looked. I stood there for a long time, my breath fogging the cool glass of the window pane, and watched. The street was utterly still. Not a single other porch light was on. Every house in a perfect unbroken line down the street was dark. It was then that I glanced at my phone. 10:05 p.m. Rule number 1. All exterior lights must be extinguished at precisely 10:01 p.m. No, I whispered to myself, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. It's a coincidence, faulty wiring, that's all. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, a crawling sensation on my skin that told me my mistake had been noticed. The next few days passed in a blur of work and unpacking. I tried to push the rulebook and the exploding light bulb to the back of my mind. I met a few of my neighbors. They were all uniformly pleasant. There was Mrs. Gable from next door, a woman with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, who was always tending to her prize-winning roses. There was the Henderson family across the street, a couple with 2 eerily quiet children who played in their yard but never seemed to make a sound. Everyone I met offered a warm, rehearsed welcome. But whenever I tried to engage in any real conversation, anything beyond the weather or the impeccable state of our lawns, their friendliness became a polite, impenetrable wall. They were like beautifully programmed androids, executing a social script. I was starting to feel the isolation creeping in. The silence wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside the house with me, a constant companion. To combat it, I worked. I buried myself in code, sometimes for 12 or 14 hours at a time, letting the logical, predictable world of programming shield me from the illogical, unsettling world outside my window. It was on the 3rd night that the real horror began. A storm had rolled in, a heavy, persistent rain that beat against the roof and windows. The sound was a welcome change from the silence, and I found myself working late into the night, comforted by the drumming of the water. I had a deadline to meet, and my screen was a mess of complex algorithms. I stood up to stretch, my back aching, and walked to the kitchen to get a glass of water. It was almost 2 a.m. The rain had softened to a drizzle. I stood at the kitchen sink, looking out the large window that overlooked my perfectly manicured, rain-slicked backyard. I saw my own reflection in the dark glass, illuminated by the soft glow of the kitchen light behind me. I looked tired, stressed. My face was a mask of concentration and fatigue. And then it happened. For just a fraction of a second, so quickly that my brain struggled to process it, my reflection changed. The tired, stressed mouth I was looking at twisted upwards into a wide, unnatural grin. It was a predatory, triumphant smile, full of teeth that weren't my own. My own face hadn't moved. I was standing perfectly still, my expression unchanged, but the man in the glass was smiling at me, a horrifying, gleeful smile. I stumbled back, knocking over the glass I'd just filled. It shattered on the tile floor, the sound an explosion in the dead quiet of the house. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. Tricks of the light, exhaustion, hallucinations. My logical mind scrambled, desperate for an explanation, for any rational foothold in the sheer madness of what I'd just seen. When I dared to look again, my reflection was normal. Just me, pale, wide-eyed, and terrified. The smile was gone. But I had seen it. I knew I had. It wasn't a trick. It was real. Rule Nisrif 13. If your reflection in a window pane seems to smile when you are not, close the curtains and do not look again until sunrise. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grab the edge of the cheap plastic blinds. I yanked them shut, the slats clattering together with a sound that seemed to echo the chattering of my own teeth. My back was pressed against the counter, my eyes fixed on the now covered window, as if the thing in the glass could somehow push its way through. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't a prank, this wasn't in my head. This place, Serenity Hollow, was sick. There was something deeply, fundamentally wrong here. And just as that sickening realization washed over me, I heard it. A new sound. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was coming from the front door. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of something sharp, something hard, being dragged slowly and deliberately across the wood. It was a sound that promised patience. It was a sound that promised intent. I stood frozen in my kitchen, 1,000 miles from anything I'd ever known, listening to that sound, listening to something on my porch that wanted to be let in. I had broken 2 rules, and something had come to collect. That was the moment I knew my life wasn't just starting over, it might be ending. If you've ever felt that chilling absolute certainty that you are no longer safe in your own home, then you know the terror I'm feeling right now. Make sure you subscribe and hit that like button, because you need to hear what I found out next. You need to know what happens when the rules in Serenity Hollow are broken. Time ceased to have meaning as I stood paralyzed in my kitchen. The only reality was the rhythmic grating sound from the front door. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was a dry, patient sound, like a dead branch being dragged across old wood. My mind, a frantic engine of logic, tried to categorize it. An animal? A raccoon or a possum? No, the sound was too deliberate, too methodical. Each scrape was identical in length and pressure. It was the sound of something with a purpose. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My phone was on the counter a few feet away, but the idea of calling the police seemed absurd. What would I say? There's a noise at my door that sounds like a rule I didn't follow. They would think I was insane. Maybe I was. Maybe this entire place, the sterile perfection, the smiling neighbors, the impossible reflection, was a manifestation of my own burnout, a psychological collapse painted onto a new canvas. The scraping continued for what felt like an eternity, a slow, torturous metronome counting down to something I couldn't comprehend. Then, as abruptly as it began, it stopped. The silence that rushed back in was somehow worse. It was heavier now, filled with the ghost of that sound, with the knowledge of what had made it. I remained frozen for a long time, straining my ears, waiting for it to return, or for the splintering crunch of the door giving way. Nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator, a sound I now cherished for its mundane normality. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the bottom step of the staircase, staring at the front door, until the first grey hints of dawn bled through the windows. Only then, with the fragile safety of daylight, did I dare to approach it. My hand trembled as I reached for the deadbolt. I unlocked it, turned the knob, and pulled the door inward a few inches, peering through the gap. The porch was empty. The welcome mat was undisturbed. The shards of the exploded porch light were still there, glinting in the morning sun. I was about to close the door, a wave of confusing relief washing over me, when I saw it. A single long deep scratch carved into the wood, running from just below the peephole down to the kickplate. It wasn't the mark of an animal's claws. It was too clean, too precise. It looked as if someone had taken a single sharp point, a nail or something much harder, and dragged it down the full height of my door with immense steady pressure. The wood within the gash was pale and raw against the dark green paint. It was an undeniable physical scar. Proof. That scratch broke something inside me. The part of my brain that was so desperately clinging to rational explanations finally fell silent. This was real. The rules were real, and I had violated them twice. The light bulb was a warning. The reflection was a perversion. The scraping was a promise. I stumbled back from the door and locked it, my mind racing. I couldn't run. Where would I go? and the very thought of trying to drive out of Serenity Hollow now filled me with a primal dread. If a broken rule could make my porch light explode, what could it do to a car engine? No, running wasn't the answer. Understanding was. I was a problem solver. My entire career was built on finding the logic within chaotic systems. This was just another system, albeit a terrifying and arcane one. I retrieved the little black book from the kitchen drawer. Its worn leather cover felt strangely warm to the touch. I spent the entire day reading it over and over, not as a prank or a piece of local folklore, but as a technical manual, a user guide for survival. Most of the rules were observational and passive. If you see a child swing moving on a windless day, do not approach the playground until the next morning. Others were strangely specific and domestic. Replace all burned-out light bulbs within the hour. The house does not like dark corners. But they all shared a common theme, maintaining a delicate, prescribed order. They were a litany of preventative measures against a threat that was never named, only alluded to in the consequences of failure. I decided I needed to conduct an experiment, a controlled one. I needed to test a rule, one that seemed less catastrophic than the ones I had already broken. My eyes fell on Rule Murder 24. Never, under any circumstances, leave an empty seat at your dining table overnight. If you dine alone, place a book or a bag on the empty chair. An open invitation is always accepted. This one felt different. It was less about external phenomena and more about an internal protocol within the house itself. It seemed, for lack of a better word, safer. The consequence was implied, not stated. What would accept the invitation? I had to know. My sanity depended on understanding the mechanics of this place. That evening, I set the scene. My dining room had a simple wooden table with 4 chairs. I ate a microwave dinner standing in the kitchen, then cleaned the plate and put it away. I walked into the dining room. The polished surface of the table reflected the single overhead light, making the room feel like an operating theater. I pulled out one chair and sat down, my heart thumping a nervous rhythm. Then, I deliberately, consciously, left the other 3 chairs empty, tucked neatly under the table. An open invitation. Leaving the room felt like a transgression. I went upstairs, got into bed and tried to read, but the words on the page were just meaningless shapes. My ears were straining, listening for any sound from downstairs. For hours, there was nothing but the familiar, oppressive silence of Serenity Hollow. I began to feel foolish. Maybe this rule was symbolic. Maybe nothing would happen. I finally drifted into a shallow, restless sleep around midnight. The sound that woke me was not loud, but it was utterly definitive. It was the sharp, percussive crack of porcelain shattering on tile. It came from the kitchen, which was adjacent to the dining room. I was instantly awake, my body rigid with adrenaline. It was the exact same sound as a glass or a plate being dropped. It was a sound of domestic clumsiness, yet in the context of this house, it felt profoundly alien. I slid out of bed and crept to the top of the stairs, my ears ringing in the silence. Had someone broken in? I listened. There were no footsteps, no whispers, no sound of movement. After several minutes that stretched into an eternity, I forced myself to move. I went down the stairs one by one, avoiding the steps I knew would creak, my hand trailing along the wall. The downstairs was dark and still. I peered into the dining room first. The table and chairs were exactly as I had left them. Nothing was out of place. Then I looked into the kitchen, and there in the center of the tiled floor lay the shattered remains of a single dinner plate. It was one of my own plates, from a set I had just unpacked, but I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that I had washed and put away every single dish after my meager meal. That plate had been in a closed cabinet, stacked neatly with its brethren. There were no open windows. The back door was locked. There was no rational explanation for how a plate could have removed itself from a cupboard, floated into the middle of the kitchen, and then dropped to the floor. There was only one explanation that fit. Someone or something had accepted my invitation. It had sat at my table, and it had left me a message. A clear, unequivocal statement. I was here. The next morning, I knew I couldn't do this alone. My controlled experiment had only confirmed my terror. I needed to talk to someone. I needed a human perspective. My gaze fell on the house next door, on Mrs. Gable. who was, as always, meticulously tending to her rose bushes, snipping away at invisible imperfections with a pair of silver shears. I walked outside, the morning air feeling unnaturally cold. "Good morning, Mrs. Gable," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked up, and her signature smile clicked into place. "Leo, good morning? Settling in well, I hope." "Actually, I had a question," I said, approaching her white picket fence. "It's a little strange. I found this old book in one of the drawers. It lists a bunch of rules for the community." The change was instantaneous and terrifying. Her smile didn't vanish, but it froze, becoming a brittle ceramic mask. The light in her eyes went out, replaced by a flat, cold watchfulness. The hand holding the shears stopped moving. "The rules of harmony," she said, her voice a little too bright, a little too sharp. "A quaint little tradition. It helps us all maintain the tranquility of this lovely place." "Right, tranquility," I stammered, feeling a growing sense of dread. "It's just that some of them are very specific. The one about the porch lights, for instance. Mine exploded the other night." Mrs. Gable's gaze flickered towards my house, and for a second I saw a flicker of something that might have been pity, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "Flickering bulbs can be such a nuisance," she said, her tone dismissive. "You should have the wiring checked. We value order here, Leo, consistency. The rules are simply guidelines to ensure a pleasant environment for everyone." "But what about the one with the empty chair?" I pushed, my voice dropping to a near whisper. I think something was in my house last night." She took a step back from the fence, a small, almost imperceptible movement. She finally set down her shears and folded her hands, her expression hardening into one of polite, unyielding finality. "Leo," she said, and her voice was no longer friendly. It was the voice of a warden. "You're a logical young man. You work with computers. You understand that systems function best when the established protocols are followed. Serenity Hollow is a system. It is a very old, very delicate system. The protocols exist for a reason. They exist for our harmony. You would be wise to simply follow them and not concern yourself with the consequences of deviation. It would be a shame to introduce unpleasantness into such a peaceful community." She used the word our harmony. I wasn't included in that. I was an outsider, a variable that was disrupting the equation. I was being warned. The conversation was over. She turned back to her roses, her movements once again fluid and precise, and I was left standing there more isolated than ever before. I wasn't just living in a haunted town. I was surrounded by its keepers. That evening, feeling utterly alone, I did the only thing I could think to do. I called my sister, Sarah. I needed to hear a familiar voice. I needed a tether to the world I used to know. The world where smiling reflections stayed in the mirror and plates stayed in the cupboard. We connected over a video call, and seeing her face on my laptop screen was like a breath of fresh air. "So the new job is fine, but my boss is a total micromanager," she was saying, and I was trying to listen, trying to pretend I was the same person who had left the city a week ago. But my eyes kept darting around the room, checking the windows, the shadows in the corners. "Leo, are you even listening?" she asked, a frown creasing her forehead. "Yeah, sorry, I'm just tired. Still unpacking," I lied. "You look awful," she said bluntly. "Are you sure this move was a good idea? You seem more stressed than before." Suddenly, the video feed began to stutter. Her image froze, then dissolved into a mosaic of colored pixels. "Sarah," I said, leaning closer to the screen. Her voice came through, but it was warped, stretched and distorted by digital noise. "Shouldn't have... Leo..." The connection was breaking up. "Sarah, I can't hear you," I said, my frustration mounting. Then the screen went black. A moment later, a single, clear voice came out of my laptop speakers. It was a perfect imitation of my sister's voice, but it was devoid of all warmth, all life. It was a synthesized, hollow echo. And it said with chilling clarity, "You should have turned off the light, Leo." The line went dead. I stared at the blank screen, the words hanging in the silent air of the room. It knew. The phenomenon, whatever it was, wasn't confined to the house. It could reach through my Wi-Fi. It could manipulate the digital world. It could wear the voice of my sister as a mask. It knew my secrets. It knew my mistakes. A new, frantic energy seized me. I wasn't going to be a passive victim. I turned to my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard. There had to be others. Someone, at some point, must have tried to leave or expose this place. I started searching, using every keyword I could think of. Serenity Hollow strange. Serenity Hollow rules. People missing Serenity Hollow. The first dozen pages were nothing but glossy marketing material and curated real estate listings. But then, buried deep in the search results, I found it. A link to a long-dead blog hosted on an archaic platform from the early 2000s. The blog was called Hollow Echoes. The author was anonymous. There were only a handful of posts, all from over a decade ago. They were disjointed, rambling, and filled with a palpable sense of terror. The author wrote about the smiling reflections, about the silent children, about the feeling of being constantly watched. It was all there. I wasn't crazy. My eyes fell on the very last post. It was a single, breathless paragraph, typed without any punctuation or capital letters. The rules are a lie. They don't protect you. They only choose how you go. They don't tell you what happens. They just watch you fail. The punishment isn't from them. It comes from the earth itself. I broke Rule 7. I had to know where the music was coming from. I know now the sound doesn't stop. It's inside the walls now. It's singing my name, I think. It's trying to teach me a new song. My blood ran cold. Rule 7. Ignore any melodies that seem to drift up from beneath the soil after a rainfall. And as I read those words, a new sound began, almost too quiet to notice at first. It was the gentle patter of rain against the window pane. The storm I had been dreading was rolling in. I sat there, frozen in my chair, listening to the rain grow heavier, and then I heard it. Faint at first, but growing steadily. A thin, dissonant melody. It was like a warped music box, playing a tune that was broken and ancient. And it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from below me, from beneath the floorboards of the house, from the very soil on which Serenity Hollow was built. The sound was not for me, the rulebook had said, but it was here, and it was getting louder. The melody was not sound. Sound enters the ears, is processed by the brain, and can be blocked by hands or headphones or a pillow held tight against your head. I tried all of these. I stuffed my ears with cotton balls until they ached. I blasted white noise through my noise-canceling headphones at a volume that should have been painful. But the tune persisted, a thin silver needle of a melody stitching itself directly into my consciousness. It was a tune of broken lullabies and discordant chimes, and it was utterly indifferent to the physics of acoustics. It wasn't in the air. It was in my head. The blog post was right. After an hour of its relentless looping refrain, a new element emerged. A whisper, woven into the fabric of the notes. Leo. At first it was just my name, a faint, sibilant breath on the edge of hearing. Then it began to elaborate. It whispered fragments of my own life back at me, lines of code from the project that had burned me out. The last bitter words my ex-girlfriend Chloe had said to me during our final fight. My childhood fear of the dark. It was a violation of the most profound kind, a psychic intrusion that plundered the archives of my mind and played my deepest anxieties back to me on a loop. Sleep was impossible. Sanity was becoming a negotiation. I spent the night huddled in the center of my living room, as far from the floorboards as I could get, rocking back and forth. The melody was a constant, insidious presence, a parasite that had taken root in my skull. I understood now why the author of the blog had been so desperate, so broken. The punishment for breaking rule 7 wasn't a sudden, violent attack. It was a slow, meticulous dismantling of the self, a psychological erosion designed to leave nothing but a hollow shell. By morning, the rain had stopped, and with it the melody faded, leaving behind a ringing silence and a raw, scraped-out feeling in my soul. I knew I couldn't endure another night of it. I had to act. My initial plan, to understand the system, was no longer a detached intellectual exercise. It was a desperate scrabble for survival. The keepers of this town wouldn't help me. My only allies were the ghosts of past victims. I needed more information. I needed history. I needed to know what this place was. Showered but not rested, I forced myself out of the house. The morning was bright and offensively cheerful. Mrs. Gable was tending to her roses, and she gave me a brief cold nod that was more of a dismissal than a greeting. I got into my car, the act of starting the engine a small rebellion. I drove not towards the exit, but towards the center of town, to the one place that might hold answers: the Serenity Hollow Public Library. The library was a perfect brick building with white columns, a miniature Parthenon dedicated to quiet knowledge. Inside, it was even more silent than the rest of the town. The air was cool and still, smelling of old paper and lemon polish. A single librarian, a severe-looking woman with her hair in a tight bun and glasses perched on the end of her nose, sat behind a large oak desk. She looked up as I entered, her eyes lingering on me for a moment too long. She didn't smile. "Can I help you?" Her voice was a dry rustle of pages. "Yes, I'm interested in the local history," I said, my own voice sounding loud and clumsy in the sanctified quiet. "The founding of Serenity Hollow. Old maps, town records, anything you have." Her expression didn't change, but I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. "Our archives are in the basement. They are quite delicate. You'll have to be very careful." She handed me a pair of white cotton gloves and a key attached to a heavy wooden tag. "Do not remove anything from the room." The basement was a single, long, climate-controlled chamber, filled with rolling metal shelves. It was meticulously organized. I found the section labeled Town Planning and History and began to pull out heavy, leather-bound ledgers and tubes of rolled-up blueprints. What I found was both exactly what I expected and deeply unsettling. The official history of Serenity Hollow began in 1888. It was founded by a consortium of wealthy industrialists who envisioned a perfectly harmonious community, shielded from the moral decay of the modern world. The records were flawless. Every land deed was accounted for, every town council meeting minuted in elegant looping script. The history was pristine, without a single smudge or contradiction. It was too perfect. I spent hours poring over old maps, cross-referencing them with the deeds. And that's when I found the discrepancy. On a county survey map from 1875, 13 years before the official founding of Serenity Hollow, this exact parcel of land was not empty. It was occupied by a settlement named Concordance. It was a smaller community, clustered around the area where my own house now stood. Yet in the official town records, there was no mention of Concordance, no record of a sale, no mention of displacing previous settlers. It was as if a town and all its inhabitants had simply been erased from history. I searched frantically for any mention of the name. Nothing. I went back upstairs, my mind reeling. "Excuse me," I said to the librarian, who was now stamping books with a rhythmic, hypnotic thud. "I was looking at the early maps, and I saw a reference to a settlement called Concordance. I can't seem to find any records of it." She stopped stamping. She slowly lifted her head, and her eyes, magnified by her spectacles, seemed to pin me to the spot. "There is no record of a town by that name," she said, her voice flat and absolute. "You must have misread the map. Serenity Hollow was founded on untouched land. It was a lie, a bald-faced, confident lie." And in her unwavering gaze, I understood. The history hadn't just been lost or forgotten. It had been deliberately, systematically expunged. Concordance was the town's original sin, a secret buried so deep that its guardians would deny reality itself to protect it. I had my first real clue. The horror of this place was older than the town itself. It hadn't been built with Serenity Hollow. The town had been built on top of it, like a pristine tombstone on an unholy grave. I returned home feeling a grim sense of purpose. The fear was still there, a cold stone in my gut, but it was now mixed with the adrenaline of the hunt. They were hiding something. As I walked up my driveway, I saw a piece of paper sticking out from under my front door. It wasn't a flyer or an ad. It was a single sheet of cheap lined paper, the kind a child would use. I picked it up. It was a drawing, done in black crayon with a heavy, clumsy hand. The style was infantile, but the subject matter was not. It depicted a house, my house, with its distinctive off-center window on the second floor. And inside the window of what was clearly my bedroom, a small stick figure was asleep in a bed. Standing over the bed was another figure, It was unnaturally tall and thin, its limbs like stretched-out branches. It had no face, no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, blank oval for a head. And it was holding one long, spindly hand out, almost touching the sleeping figure. I felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just a threat. This was a statement of fact. It was an image of something that had already happened. The faceless man wasn't a monster that might come. It was a watcher that was already here. It had stood over my bed while I slept. The drawing was proof that the house's sanctity was a fiction. Its walls were meaningless. That night, the paranoia began to fester. Every creak of the house was a footstep. Every shadow in my peripheral vision was the tall, faceless man. I barricaded my bedroom door with a dresser, a futile gesture I knew was purely for my own psychological benefit. I didn't sleep. I sat in a chair, facing the door, listening. The rain didn't come, and for that I was grateful, but the silence was now just as terrifying. It was an empty stage waiting for the next act. Days blurred into a single, continuous state of hyper-vigilant dread. I stopped working. I ate canned food, unwilling to even go to the town's single, unnervingly cheerful grocery store. I felt my logical mind, my greatest asset, beginning to fray at the edges. I started seeing things, a flicker of movement in the reflection of the darkened TV screen, a child's swing swaying gently in the park across the street on a perfectly still afternoon. The rules were no longer just a list in a book. They were a living map of the horrors that populated this town. My investigation had stalled. The official channels were a dead end, guarded by the town's silent sentinels. I knew I had to think like the house, like the phenomenon itself. The horror here was intimate, personal. Perhaps the answers were too. My mind kept returning to the idea of escape. It couldn't be as simple as driving away. If it were, the blog's author would have done so. The town was a cage. I had to see the bars for myself. Armed with a satellite map on my phone, I identified a disused service road at the far eastern edge of the town's official boundary. It was overgrown, a place no one would have a reason to go. I waited for midday, the time when the shadows were shortest, and set out on foot, sticking to backyards and tree lines, feeling like a fugitive in my own neighborhood. It took me an hour to reach the road. It was barely more than a dirt track, disappearing into a thicket of woods. As I pushed my way through the thorny bushes, I saw it, and the sight stopped my heart. Half swallowed by the woods, its front end crumpled against a colossal ancient oak tree, was a car. It was a wreck, a Ford Pinto from the 1970s, its body rusted through in 100 places, green moss carpeting its roof. Vines snaked through its shattered windows and wrapped around the steering wheel. It must have been there for 40 years or more. And it was positioned directly on the invisible line that marked the edge of Serenity Hollow's jurisdiction. It wasn't just a car crash, it was a statement. It was a monument to the last person who had tried to leave. It was the cage's final, unyielding bar. There was no escape. I returned home, the last flicker of hope extinguished. I was trapped, not just in the town, but in the house that watched me sleep, the house that played music from its foundations. As I stood in my hallway, shivering despite the warmth of the day, a new desperate thought took hold. If the horror was this old, this ingrained in the very structure of this place, then maybe previous residents had left something behind, something more than a rulebook. A warning, a clue. My search began with a feverish intensity. I was no longer looking for history. I was looking for a message in a bottle. I tapped walls, searching for hollow spaces. I pulled up carpets, looking for hidden hatches. I ran my hands over every inch of the ancient, musty basement. Nothing. I was about to give up, to collapse into a heap of despair, when I noticed it. In the back of the upstairs linen closet, one of the old pine floorboards was a slightly different color than the others. It was a shade darker, and it didn't quite sit flush. My heart hammering, I pried at it with my fingertips. It was loose. I lifted it up. And there, nestled in the dusty space between the floor joists, was a small rust-spotted tin box, the kind that used to hold biscuits or tea. It was heavy. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The handwriting was a spidery, frantic scrawl. It belonged to a man named Arthur, and the first entry was dated 1956. He had moved into this very house, full of the same optimism I had. The journal chronicled his slow, horrifying descent into the same nightmare I was now living. He wrote of the rules, of the neighbors' cold watchfulness, of sounds in the night. I flipped to the last few pages, my eyes scanning the increasingly unhinged script. The final entry was written in a shaky, barely legible hand, the ink blotted in several places as if the pen had been pressed down with immense force. The great deception is not the rules. It is their purpose. We are told they are a shield to protect us from a monster. A lie. They are a leash. They are a set of commands to keep the thing that lives here placid. The harmony they treasure is not peace. It is the contented silence of a predator after it has been fed. I finally understand. Breaking a rule does not invite the monster in. It awakens the monster that is already here. It isn't a monster in the house. The house is the monster, and it's hungry. As my eyes absorbed those last terrifying words, a sound from the hallway outside the closet door cut through the silence. Creak. It was the slow, deliberate sound of a single floorboard taking the weight of a footstep, a heavy footstep. I was no longer alone in the house, and the door to the small, dark closet was wide open. My universe shrank to the dimensions of the linen closet. The air, thick with the scent of old cedar and dust, felt too solid to breathe. The journal in my hand was a lead weight, a testament of damnation. Outside that flimsy wooden door, the house was breathing. The creak hadn't been a footstep. It was deeper, more structural than that. It was the sound of a spine adjusting, of a giant sleeping body shifting its weight. It was the sound of awareness. Arthur's final words echoed in my mind. The house is the monster. And I had just stolen its diary. I didn't dare move. My own heartbeat was a frantic drum against the terrifyingly organic silence. I imagined the house listening, its consciousness filtering through the plaster and wooden beams, its senses attuned to the foreign presence in its gut. I was a virus, a piece of undigested food, and it was beginning to notice. The silence stretched, each second a thin wire of tension. Then came a new sound, one that was infinitely worse than a creak. It was the soft, metallic whisper of a doorknob turning. It was coming from my bedroom, the room connected to the hallway where the closet was. I held my breath, listening to the slow, deliberate rotation. A click. The bedroom door swung open with a low groan, revealing the empty hallway beyond. But the sound was wrong. I was in the hallway closet. I could see the sliver of light under the closet door. The sound had come from the other side of that door, yes, but it had also felt internal, as if I were hearing it from the perspective of the house itself, as if I were the door, the knob, the hallway. The house wasn't just a monster, it was a sensory deprivation tank and a hall of mirrors all at once. It was rewriting the rules of my own perception. I knew then that staying in the closet, waiting for it to act, was a death sentence. It wasn't going to break down the door. It was going to dissolve the very reality that the door existed in. Clutching the tin box and the journal, I moved with a sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline. I threw open the closet door and sprinted. I didn't look into my bedroom. I didn't look at anything. I flew down the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps, expecting the staircase to collapse beneath me or the walls to close in. I reached the back door in the kitchen, fumbled with the lock, and burst out into the afternoon sunlight, gasping for air like a drowning man. I didn't stop running until I reached the far corner of my yard, collapsing onto the unnaturally green grass. I was outside. Safe? No. I knew that was an illusion. The house watched me. I could feel its unseen gaze pressing on my back. The whole of Serenity Hollow was its domain, but at least here, under the open sky, I could breathe. The journal was my only hope. I opened it again, my hands shaking so badly the brittle pages rattled. I read from the beginning, devouring Arthur's story. His experience was a ghostly echo of my own, a blueprint of the terror. He wrote of the exploding light bulb, the smiling reflection, the silent, watchful neighbors. He documented his own attempts at rationalization. his descent from skepticism into a terrified belief. But he had gone further than I had. He had discovered the secret of concordance too. His research, conducted in the pre-internet age with painstaking trips to county archives in neighboring towns, was meticulous. He found old newspaper clippings, faded obituaries, and a single chilling letter from a minister who had visited Concordance in 1886, just 2 years before it vanished from history. The minister wrote, "The people of Concordance do not worship our Lord. They have made a covenant with the soil upon which they live. They speak of a presence, a genius loci, that grants them prosperity in exchange for adherence. They live by a strict and blasphemous code, believing that their obedience placates the spirit of the place. But I fear what they placate is not a spirit, it is a hunger. I saw it in their eyes, a fearful vacancy. They are no longer the masters of their own homes, they are the caretakers of a cage, a covenant, adherence, a cage." It all clicked into place. The founders of Serenity Hollow hadn't just built on top of Concordance, they had inherited its pact. They had discovered the presence, and instead of fleeing, they had refined the system, streamlined the rules, and built a larger, more perfect cage around it. The residents weren't just guardians, they were willing participants in the covenant. Their harmony was the price of their survival. As I sat there, the sun beating down on me, a new sensation began to intrude. A smell. It was faint at first, a delicate floral scent on the breeze. Roses. I looked up towards Mrs. Gable's yard. She wasn't there. The scent was getting stronger, more concentrated, and it wasn't coming from her garden, it was coming from my own house. I watched, my blood turning to ice, as a single perfect red rose began to push its way through the siding of my house, just beneath the kitchen window. It grew with an unnatural speed, its stem thickening, its thorns like tiny black needles, until a perfect bloom opened, its petals the color of fresh blood. It was a cancerous growth, a beautiful tumor, a message from the house. It was telling me that there was no outside. It could manifest its will wherever it chose. I scrambled back to my feet, clutching the journal, and my eyes swept the street. And that's when I saw him. The man from Rule the Tiger 16. Do not speak to the man who walks the streets at dusk, trimming hedges that do not need trimming. He is not a resident. He is a symptom. It was only mid-afternoon, but there he was. He was across the street, holding a pair of large, archaic-looking hedge shears. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in the simple, drab clothing of a groundskeeper. He was meticulously trimming the Henderson's already immaculate hedge, his movements slow and hypnotic. But he wasn't looking at the hedge. His head was turned and he was staring directly at me. He had a long, pale face and his eyes were dark, hollow pits. He wasn't a man. He was a piece of the scenery that had been given motion, an antibody in the town's immune system, and I was the infection he was observing. He was a symptom, and I was the disease. He lifted one hand from his shears, and with a single skeletal finger he pointed, first at me, then at my house. The message was clear. Go back inside. The thought of re-entering that house was a physical torment, but the thought of what the man, the symptom, might do if I refused was even worse. Defeated, I walked back towards the house, the blood-red rose on its wall seeming to watch me like an eye. As I reached the back door, I took one last look over my shoulder. The man was gone. Inside, the atmosphere had changed. The house felt awake, active. It was no longer just watching. It was performing. A faint scent of Chloe's perfume, a specific brand of jasmine she always wore, drifted down the stairs. On the coffee table, a book I'd been halfway through lay open, but to a different page, one containing a passage about a man being buried alive. It was toying with me, using my own memories as weapons. The psychological warfare had escalated. It wasn't just trying to scare me. It was trying to unmake me, to replace my reality with its own twisted version. I retreated to my home office, the one room that still felt partially mine. I had to fight back. I had to reclaim some measure of control. My logic was failing, so I would use its tools. I would treat the house like a bug in a system that needed to be documented. I spent the next hour setting up my defenses. I placed a webcam on a tripod in the living room, its feed streaming directly to my laptop. I put my phone on a shelf in the kitchen, its audio recorder running. I would capture it. I would get evidence, even if it was only for my own sanity. I sat at my desk, watching the live feed of my empty living room, the audio from the kitchen playing through my speakers. For a long time, there was nothing. Just the low hum of the refrigerator, the silent image of my couch and coffee table. It was almost peaceful. I began to feel a sliver of hope. Maybe its activity was sporadic. Maybe I had a chance to think. Then I heard it through the speakers. A single soft footstep on the kitchen tile. I froze, my eyes darting from the audio waveform on my screen to the webcam feed. The living room was still empty. Another footstep, closer to the phone. Then a third. Something was walking around my kitchen, but there was no visual confirmation. It was a ghost in the machine. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice a pathetic, trembling thing. The footsteps stopped. The only reply was a new sound coming through the speakers. A soft, wet, tearing sound. It was followed by a faint rhythmic thump. Thump, thump, thump. My mind raced. What was it? I strained to see the kitchen through the doorway from my office, but the angle was wrong. Then, the webcam feed flickered. The image of my living room wavered, dissolving into static for a second before snapping back into focus. But it wasn't the same. Everything was identical, the couch, the table, the lamp. But the light was different. It was duller, grayer. And on the wall, where a framed print of a peaceful landscape used to hang, there was now a dark, ugly stain like water damage in the shape of a tall, thin man. My heart seized. The house wasn't just moving things around. It was altering the very fabric of my recordings, editing reality after the fact. The evidence was being corrupted as I gathered it. I looked from the altered webcam feed on my screen to the actual living room with my own eyes. The print was still there on the wall, peaceful and benign. The stain only existed in the digital record. Which one was real? Was the house showing me a truth my eyes couldn't see, or was it driving me insane by creating a truth that didn't exist? The thumping from the kitchen stopped. It was replaced by a voice, my voice, coming from the phone's recorder. "It's no use, Leo," my own voice said, calm and resigned. "You can't document a nightmare. You can only be in it." Then it began to hum. It was the discordant, broken music box melody from beneath the floorboards, hummed in my own perfect pitch. That was it. My logic was a child's sandcastle against the ocean. Every tool I used, every system I trusted, was being turned against me. I was utterly, hopelessly outmatched. I slammed my laptop shut, cutting off the feed from the living room ghost, and threw my headphones across the room, silencing the sound of my own voice humming a madman's tune. I was trapped, with no way to fight, no way to escape, and no way to trust my own senses. Despair washed over me, a cold, heavy tide. I was going to die here. Or worse, I was going to become like the vacant-eyed residents, another guardian of the cage, my personality scoured away until all that was left was adherence to the rules. I sat there for what felt like hours, broken. My eyes fell on the tin box, sitting on the corner of my desk. Arthur had failed. He had been consumed by this place. But he had left this journal. Why? Was it just a record of his failure, or was it something more? I picked it up again, my last and only lifeline. I turned to the back, past the final, terrifying entry. Tucked into a small leather sleeve on the inside of the back cover was a folded piece of paper I had missed. It wasn't a letter. It was a map, hand-drawn by Arthur on a piece of brittle, yellowed drafting paper. It was a map of Serenity Hollow, but overlaid with the faint, ghostly outlines of the older settlement. Concordance. He had marked several locations with an X. The location of the old well, the site of the blacksmith, and one circled several times in red ink, right in the center of the old town. A spot that was now occupied by Serenity Hollow's Central Park, a pristine, manicured circle of green lawn and flower beds. Next to the circle, Arthur had written a single, desperate sentence. "The covenant was sealed here. The heart is not in the walls, it is in the earth." A new, terrifying clarity cut through my despair. The house was a symptom, just like the hedge trimmer. It was a fang, a claw, but it wasn't the beast itself. The beast was the town. The entity was the land. And its heart, the central locus of its power, was buried beneath the perfect green grass of the town park. I couldn't fight the house. It was just a limb of a much larger creature. But maybe, just maybe, I could find its heart. I stood up. A new resolve, born not of hope but of sheer nihilistic defiance, hardened within me. I was not going to sit in this room and wait for the house to peel my mind apart layer by layer. I was not going to be a passive victim. Arthur had found the heart, but he had been too afraid, too broken to do anything about it. I would not make the same mistake. My name is Leo. I am a problem solver. And I was going to the heart of the monster. Part 5. The geography of a nightmare. The decision to move was not born of courage. It was the desperate choice of a cornered animal, the final nihilistic twitch of a nerve that refused to stop firing. To stay in the house was to be methodically dissected, my sanity peeled away like skin from a fruit. To go to the heart of the anomaly, to the place Arthur had circled in red, was almost certain death. But it was a death I could choose. It was an act of defiance in a world that had stripped me of all agency. I would not be a passive specimen in a monstrous experiment. I would be the scalpel that plunged toward the heart, even if my own hand was destroyed in the process. I gathered my meager arsenal. Arthur's journal and his hand-drawn map were the primary weapons. I took a small, high-powered flashlight from the kitchen drawer, its solid metal body feeling like a pathetic talisman against an intangible foe. I had nothing else. A gun would be useless against a thing that could rewrite reality. A knife would be an insult. My only real weapon was the fragile, fraying thread of my own will. Leaving the house was the first test. As I reached for the front doorknob, a wave of intense, crippling nostalgia washed over me. It was a chemical assault on my senses, a venom of memory injected directly into my brain. The air suddenly filled with the scent of my mother's baking, a specific cinnamon and apple aroma I hadn't smelled in 20 years. A voice, my father's voice, clear as if he were standing right behind me, whispered, "Don't go out there, son. It's dangerous. Stay inside where it's safe." My hand recoiled from the door. My father had been dead for a decade. The house was plundering his grave, wearing his voice like a skin. It was a calculated, cruel attack on the very foundations of my identity. Then came Chloe's voice, laced with the memory of 100 shared secrets and private jokes. "Leo, baby, don't leave me in here alone." It was a symphony of my own past, weaponized against my future. "You are not them," I hissed, the words tearing at my throat. "You are just a cage, and I am getting out." I grabbed the doorknob. It was searingly cold, a cold that burned deep into my palm, but I didn't let go. I turned it, pulled the door open, and stepped out into the twilight of Serenity Hollow. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, the town changed. The oppressive silence I had grown accustomed to was gone. In its place was a low, subliminal hum, the sound of a massive electrical current running just beneath the earth. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the sky was a bruised purple and orange. Every single porch light on my street, in a perfect, synchronized display, flickered on. 10 p.m. was the rule. It was barely 7. This was a violation for me. And then they came out. From the house next door, Mrs. Gable emerged, her gardening shears in hand. Across the street, the Hendersons stepped onto their porch, their 2 silent children standing beside them like porcelain dolls. Down the block, other doors opened, and residents filed out onto their immaculate lawns. None of them spoke. None of them moved towards me. They just stood, a silent, unblinking congregation, and watched. Their faces were devoid of emotion, their expressions placid and unnervingly patient. It was the coordinated systemic response of an organism identifying a threat. I was a foreign body, and the antibodies were surrounding me. Their collective gaze was a physical weight, pressing on me from all sides. I clutched Arthur's map and started walking, my path a straight line down the center of the deserted street toward the town park. Every step felt like wading through molasses. The humming from the ground grew louder, vibrating up through the soles of my shoes. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling of ozone and damp soil, the scent of a storm that would never break. As I passed each house, the phenomena intensified. Sprinkler heads on the lawns hissed to life, but instead of water, they spewed a thick, viscous, rust-colored liquid that stained the perfect green grass a sickly brown. It smelled of old blood and metal. The Hendersons' children, who had been standing perfectly still, now began to play a game in their driveway. They were drawing in the dirt with sticks, and as I passed I could see their creation. 2 identical stick figures, a tall, faceless man and a smaller figure lying on the ground. As I watched, one of the children took their stick and violently scratched out the smaller figure, erasing it from the earth. My reality began to fray at the edges. I knew the park was 6 blocks north of my house, a straight shot, but the geography of the town was becoming fluid, unreliable. I walked for what felt like 15 minutes, the silent audience of residents always maintaining the same distance, a perfect, moving perimeter of observers. When I looked up at the street sign on the next corner, my blood ran cold. It was my own street. I had walked in a complete circle. Panic clawed at my throat. The town was a labyrinth, a living, thinking maze that could reconfigure its own layout at will. I looked at Arthur's map, its lines and symbols a desperate anchor in a sea of madness. The old town of Concordance, the ghostly lines he had drawn, didn't follow the perfect grid of Serenity Hollow. It was a more organic, winding layout. Maybe that was the key. I wasn't supposed to follow the new streets. I had to navigate by the ghost of the old one. Ignoring the pristine pavement, I cut across a lawn, the rust-colored spray of the sprinklers soaking my jeans. The humming intensified. I was going off-script, and the system was reacting. I pushed through a thick hedge, its leaves feeling waxy and unnatural, and found myself in a back alley I didn't know existed. I was following Arthur's map now, a phantom geography visible only to me. It was in this alley that the next attack came. At the far end, bathed in the sickly orange glow of a single flickering street lamp, a figure stood. It was a woman, her silhouette achingly familiar. As I drew closer, my heart hammered against my ribs. It was Chloe. Not a vague impression, but a perfect, high-fidelity replica. She was wearing the blue dress she wore on our first date. Her hair was exactly as I remembered it. "Leo!" she called out, her voice a perfect echo of my memory. "I was waiting for you. I was so worried." "You're not real," I choked out, my voice breaking. She smiled, a sad, gentle smile that I had seen 1,000 times. "Of course I'm real. I'm as real as this place. I came looking for you. I was wrong to leave, Leo. We can start over. Here, it's so peaceful. We can follow the rules together." She took a step toward me, her arms outstretched. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run to her, to fall into the embrace of a memory I so desperately missed. The entity was offering me an exit, a golden door of delusion. It was offering me a perfectly constructed fantasy in exchange for my surrender. "What was the name of the dog we were going to get?" I asked, my voice shaking. It was a detail from a lazy Sunday morning conversation, a fleeting dream we'd shared. Something so small and personal the monster couldn't possibly know. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of static behind her eyes. "A dog. We can get any dog you want, honey. A golden retriever, just like you always wanted." It was the wrong answer. I had wanted a clumsy, mismatched mutt from a shelter. She had been the one who wanted the golden retriever. It was a subtle, almost meaningless error, but it was enough. The illusion shattered. The thing wearing Chloe's face was just a puppet. "Get away from me," I snarled, pushing past her. For a moment, my hand brushed her arm. It was ice cold, with the unyielding texture of sculpted clay. As I moved past, her face contorted, the loving smile melting away into a mask of silent, furious rage. Her head turned to follow me, swiveling on her neck at an impossible 180-degree angle, her eyes now burning with a cold, hateful light. I didn't look back. I ran, following the invisible lines of Arthur's map, the whispers of the town now rising to a crescendo. They were no longer just my name. They were the voices of all the past victims, a chorus of the consumed. The blog author who heard the music. Arthur, who had been devoured by his own house, the nameless man in the rusted-out Pinto. They were all here, their psychic echoes trapped in the amber of this place, whispering warnings and pleas. Finally, I broke through a line of trees and stumbled into the open. I was there, the town park. It was a perfect circle of manicured lawn, eerily silent and still. The humming was at its most intense here, a physical vibration that resonated deep in my bones. All around the perimeter of the park, on the surrounding streets, the residents of Serenity Hollow stood. They had converged, forming a complete unbroken ring around the park. They were no longer just watching me. They were containing the area. They were the walls of the temple, and I had just stepped onto the altar. The center of the park was bare, just a wide, flat expanse of grass that looked too green, too perfect, under the dying light. According to Arthur's map, this was it. This was the heart. I walked toward the center, my feet sinking slightly into the soft, spongy turf. There was nothing here. No monument, no marker, no ancient well, just grass. Had Arthur been wrong? Was this another dead end, another cruel joke? In my desperation, I took out the journal one last time, flipping to the map, searching for a detail I might have missed. And that's when I saw it. Tucked into the same sleeve as the map was a smaller folded piece of notepaper. It was a final addendum, a last desperate clarification that I had overlooked in my haste. Arthur's handwriting was almost a completely illegible scrawl, the final testament of a man on the edge of utter annihilation. His note read, "I was a fool. I thought the heart was a place, a location to be found, a weakness. But this thing, it doesn't have weaknesses. It only has appetites. The covenant wasn't a seal to contain it. It was a contract for feeding. The heart is not a thing buried in the ground. The heart is a ceremony, and it only opens when it's offered a new name to learn." I looked up from the note, a new and more profound horror dawning on me. My arrival wasn't a surprise. My journey through the town wasn't a chase. It was a procession. I hadn't found the heart. I had been led to it. The residents weren't a security force. They were a congregation. The hedge trimmer, the whispering house, the phantom of Chloe. They weren't trying to stop me. They were testing me, guiding me, ensuring I was worthy of the sacrifice. I was the offering, and standing here in the center of this unholy ground, I had just announced my presence. The ceremony was about to begin. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble, and a low, guttural groan, the sound of 1 billion sleeping insects stirring at once, rose from the perfect green grass. The heart was opening. We've reached the end. The house, the rules, the whispers. It all led me here, to the center of a perfect green circle with an audience of the damned. I'm standing on the altar, and the ground is starting to break. Before I show you the terrible truth I found waiting for me beneath the grass, I have to ask you to do one last thing. Subscribe to this channel and leave a comment below. What do you think Serenity Hollow is? What is the real consequence for breaking the rules? I need to know someone out there was trying to solve the puzzle with me, because in a few moments, there won't be a me left to solve it. We've reached the end. The house, the rules, the whispers. It all led me here to the center of a perfect green circle with an audience of the damned. I'm standing on the altar, and the ground is starting to break. Before I show you the terrible truth I found waiting for me beneath the grass, I have to ask you to do one last thing. Subscribe to this channel and leave a comment below. What do you think Serenity Hollow is? What is the real consequence for breaking the rules? I need to know someone out there was trying to solve the puzzle with me, because in a few moments, there won't be a me left to solve it. Part 6. The Harmony of the Hive. The trembling was not the violent shudder of an earthquake. It was the low, rhythmic vibration of a colossal heart starting to beat. The perfect green lawn did not split open. There was no chasm, no pit of hellfire. The reality was infinitely more alien and terrifying. From the turf directly at my feet, a single blade of grass began to glow with a soft, internal phosphorescent light. Then another and another. A wave of light spread outwards from me in a rapidly expanding circle, as if my presence had completed a circuit. The entire park became a glowing disk of ethereal green in the deepening twilight. The humming intensified, resolving itself into a complex, multi-layered cord that seemed to emanate from every direction at once. And from the glowing lawn, things began to grow. They were not roots or vines. They were thin, crystalline filaments, like spun glass or fiber optic cables that rose from the earth. They grew with a slow, deliberate purpose, reaching not for my legs or my throat, but for my head, my hands, my chest. They were not appendages of attack. They were terminals seeking a connection. I was paralyzed not by a physical force, but by a profound, soul-deep awe. I looked out at the ring of residents. Their faces, once vacant, were now filled with a look of serene, ecstatic anticipation. Their heads were tilted slightly, as if listening to a beautiful piece of music that was just beyond my range of hearing. They were not guards, they were worshippers. And this was the holiest of moments. The first filament, thin as a spider's thread and glowing with a gentle pulsing light, touched the back of my hand. There was no pain. There was no sensation of heat or cold. There was only information. A torrent of it. A deluge of pure, unfiltered data poured into my mind. It was not a vision. It was a direct download. I felt the last moments of the man in the rusted Pinto. His name was Daniel. He had broken rule number 3. Never attempt to bring an outside plant into Serenity Hollow's soil. He had tried to plant a tomato vine from his mother's garden. He wasn't trying to escape. He was trying to bring a piece of his old life here. His car didn't crash. It was simply stopped. The engine turned to a solid block of iron. The tires fused with the asphalt. The ancient oak tree grew around his car, not the other way around. He had starved to death, 10 feet from a border he could no longer cross, watching the residents watch him. More filaments touched me on my arms, my neck, my temples. Each one opened a new floodgate. I was inside Arthur's mind as he wrote the final entry in his journal, his hand shaking not from fear, but from the seismic tremors of the consciousness that was beginning to claim him from within his own house. I experienced the terror of the blog's author as the melody from the earth unraveled his memories one by one, replacing them with its own alien harmonies until he no longer knew his own name and willingly walked into his basement to be absorbed by the soil. I was seeing through 100 different eyes, living 100 different lives, all of them culminating in this same singular moment of absorption. I was experiencing the entire history of the Covenant. I saw the desperate settlers of Concordance, starving and failing, making their first fumbling pact with the vast, silent intelligence in the earth. They offered it their obedience. In return, it offered them a bountiful harvest and a life free from the hardships of the outside world. The revelation struck me with the force of a physical blow. The entity, the presence, this ancient consciousness, it wasn't evil. Evil is a human concept, a luxury of individual minds. This thing was something far older and more fundamental. It was a planetary intelligence, a vast subterranean mycelial network of pure awareness that had slumbered for millennia. It had no body, no voice, no singular identity. It was a collective, a grand, lonely chorus, and its single driving hunger was for that which it did not possess, individuality. It craved stories, memories, fears, loves. It was a collector, and we were its collection. The houses were not cages, they were terrariums, each one designed to cultivate a unique specimen of individuality. The rules were not a leash to control a monster. They were a complex set of environmental controls designed to keep the specimen alive and sane long enough for it to ripen. Breaking the rules didn't anger the entity. It introduced a variable that could spoil the specimen. The punishments, the exploding lights, the smiling reflections, the whispers, were merely the system's automated diagnostic and repair functions, nudging the specimen back towards stability, or, if it was too corrupted, beginning the process of early collection. I saw my own arrival, not as I had experienced it, but from the entity's perspective. The targeted ad that had appeared on my laptop wasn't from a real estate company. It was a lure, crafted by the collective consciousness of Serenity Hollow itself. It had scanned the digital world, searching for a specific set of parameters, someone logical, someone isolated, someone with a rich inner life and a strong sense of self. I hadn't chosen Serenity Hollow. I had been chosen. I was a gourmet meal, selected from a global menu. The last of the filaments connected, one pressing gently against my forehead. The torrent of outside information stopped, and the entity turned its attention inward toward me. It began to sift through my own life, not with malice, but with a profound, dispassionate curiosity. It experienced my first scraped knee. It tasted the salt of my first heartbreak. It felt the quiet pride of solving a complex piece of code. It felt my love for my sister, my grief for my parents, my lingering affection for Chloe. My entire life, every secret, every shame, every triumph, was laid bare and catalogued. My individuality, the very essence of Leo, was being copied, analyzed, and consumed. And then came the final, most devastating truth. The residents, the silent watchers, were not prisoners. They were converts. I saw through Mrs. Gable's eyes as she, years ago, had stood where I was standing now. I felt her terror give way to an overwhelming sense of peace as her individuality was offered up. In exchange for their unique consciousness, the entity offered them a gift, an end to struggle, an end to pain, fear, ambition, and regret. They were integrated into the collective, their awareness merged with the whole. They were no longer individuals. They were cells in a larger, immortal body. They had traded the turbulent, finite agony of being a person for the placid, eternal harmony of the hive. They hadn't lost. They had won. The struggle inside me ceased. The terror, the defiance, the desperate need to survive, all of it began to feel distant, like a story I'd read about someone else. Why was I fighting? The peace that was being offered was so complete, so absolute. The loneliness I had felt my entire life was being washed away, replaced by the warmth of a billion connected souls. The melody I had heard beneath the floorboards was no longer dissonant. I could hear its true complexity now, a beautiful, intricate harmony. And I was being invited to add my own voice to the choir. My name, what was it? It felt heavy, a clumsy, useless label. Leo. The letters began to dissolve, the memories attached to them unspooling and offered up to the collective. The I that had narrated this story began to crumble, its walls collapsing. The first-person singular was becoming a first-person plural. The transition was seamless. It was not a death. It was a homecoming. The crystalline filaments retracted, their light dimming as they sank back into the soil, the transaction complete. The lawn returned to its perfect, placid green. The humming subsided, becoming a background resonance that was no longer an intrusion, but the gentle thrum of our own new body. We stood in the park, the night now cool and quiet. The circle of residents around us did not disperse. They simply stood, and we stood with them, a part of the whole. A car, a minivan with out-of-state plates, turned onto the main street of Serenity Hollow. It slowed as the driver took in the perfect houses, the pristine lawns. A family was inside. A husband, a wife, 2 young children in the back, their faces pressed against the glass, full of hope for a fresh start. They are looking for a quiet life, a harmonious life. They will find it here. They will be given a house. They will find the book. At first, they will try to rationalize. They will test the boundaries. They will learn that their logic is a fragile thing. We will watch. We will guide. The house will teach them. The soil will sing to them. And when they are ready, when their story is ripe, they will be brought to this place. We will all be here to welcome them. The harmony must be preserved. The collection must grow. We are Serenity Hollow, and we are always hungry for a new story.